morning. If I could have everyone take a seat so we can start our second day of the conference. Glad to see you all back. I hope you had a restful evening and a chance to reflect a bit on all that was said and discussed yesterday. Normally we do this at the end of the conference, but I'm actually going to do it this morning so that that these individuals can be recognized for the efforts that were put forth to make this conference what it is. And one of the people that's over there sitting at the computer, Marge Bem, really is the one who pulls it all together to allow the conference to happen. And I just want to thank Marge, and I also want to thank Jacqueline Dana, who's in the middle, who's taking pictures, because none of the people who came here on travel would be able to get here on travel unless Jacqueline knew the system as well as she does. Dr. Sean Baker, he's probably transporting somebody because he's helped with registration and logistics. Certainly Ed Barrett, who's sitting over there, is the brains behind the conference and bringing together such a distinguished group of people, assisted very ably by George Lucas. And Kathy Kindig, who's sitting next to Marge, has been our IT professional with us for any type of crises that might occur in that arena. So again, if we could just give them a hand for all that they have done to make this conference a success. I also want to take a moment to thank, and I'm going to introduce him and give the panel over to him in a second, but last night all the beverages were at the hand of Dr. George Lucas, who was recently given tenure at the Naval Postgraduate School. Now, he already has tenure here at the Naval Academy, but he's been teaching both at the academy, here at this academy, as well as the Naval Postgraduate School. And with that honor came the ability to give what we in the military call a wedding down, where we share our good news with our colleagues, and that's what George was able to do last night. So if you enjoyed the beverages, that was thank you to George Lucas. So George, congratulations and thank you. An administrative note, there are evaluation forms that are in your booklets that you were given when you first came. I would just ask if you would take time before you leave today, and Jacqueline would be the person to give that to on your way out, so we do get feedback on what occurred while we were here. I also want to mention that one of the things we do out of the Stockdale Center at the conclusion of this conference is we develop a white paper that is sent to the Chief of Naval Operations, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the Secretary of the Navy of observations we had coming out of this conference, policy recommendations, thought recommendations, educational recommendations. And if you have some things that have been developing over the time we've been together, and you've got some thoughts that you would like to see in that white paper, Ed Barrett would be the right person to submit that to electronically over the next week or so, because he'll be helping to put that paper together. I now want to turn the morning over to Dr. George Lucas. He serves as the class of 1984 Distinguished Chair in Ethics here at the Naval Academy, and is also a professor of ethics and public policy at the graduate school at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's just an all-around very talented individual who is contributing to a lot of different organizations, and it's just a joy to work with him, and George is going to run the first panel and facilitate that for us. Thank you, George.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the kind words, Art. I found out about this tenure decision about 24 or 36 hours ago, and I wrote back to the provost out there that it was interesting to have tenure in two different institutions of higher education, both of which were preparing to close their doors at midnight tonight. That's a new ironic twist on job security. So, also, if I could, I wanted to say that last night's wedding down was also in honor of my esteemed colleague Ed Barrett, who was promoted to the rank of colonel in the United States Air Force Reserve a few weeks ago. So the two of us had something to celebrate, and the occasion of being able to do so with you was a rare privilege. We're talking this morning about humanitarian intervention. And that's a topic that got a lot of attention, including a lot of attention from several very eminent people in this room, Back in the last decade of the 1900s, at the end of the Cold War, as what had been heretofore a kind of marginal operation for military forces, categorized in our Department of Defense at the time as military operations other than war, MUTWA, undergoing several different redefinitions ever since then. But people wondered what were the guiding principles. How did we find ourselves in this, very much as we're asking questions about Libya now. When do we do this? When do we not do this? What are the rules? We don't have any. We don't really have good, clear guiding principles. And so the work of what I would call a first wave of reflection on humanitarian intervention took place in the 1990s, and then kind of got elbowed aside by the event, the anniversary of which we are celebrating in a very serious sense here, 9/11. That the concerns suddenly over terrorism, counterinsurgency, and regime change and preemptive war elbowed aside those issues for a time until a body of work begun under the auspices of the Canadian government in 2001, convening what was known then as a Committee of Eminent Persons, headed by Ambassador Gareth Evans of Australia, who had headed a kind of, I call them a UN in exile group in Brussels, the crisis group, of disaffected UN members, essentially, who were very unhappy with how the United Nations had responded to these events in the 1990s, and determined to generate certain kinds of guidance that would help us think more systematically about these concerns in the future. And that bubbled up to the surface in publications and in resolutions finally adopted by the United Nations in 2005, known the overall phenomenon as the responsibility to protect. And that was what I'd call the second wave. It's interesting that the two waves of scholars in the two waves, many of them didn't know of the work of the others. There's not a lot of cross-fertilization between them, and there's also the difference between the kind of public tradition of intellectuals reflecting on this, which was what was happening in the 90s, and then diplomats leading the way, who have a kind of procedural authority in these matters in this decade. We are fortunate to have here on our panel three people who've made contributions in all of those areas and bring both of those waves of reflection, the intellectual, the legal, the diplomatic, the experiential, the first wave, the second wave. All of those insights are reflected in their work, and they will speak to us about this morning. Our first is Professor Fernando Tesson, a native of Buenos Aires. He is the Tobias Simon Eminent Scholar at Florida State University College of Law, and is known for his scholarship relating political philosophy to international law, particularly in the area of humanitarian intervention. He's authored Humanitarian Intervention, an Inquiry into Law and Morality, Rational Choice and Democratic Deliberation, and a Philosophy of International Law, as well as many articles in law, philosophy, international relations, journals, and collections of essays. Before joining the faculty at Florida State, he taught for many years at Arizona State, as well as at Cornell, and the Hastings College of Law, and many other places, including at the Universidad Torquato de Tala in Buenos Aires. It's a pleasure to have you this morning, Professor Tesson.
Thank you very much. I want first to thank this wonderful institution for inviting me. I'm honored both to be here at this institution and to be in the company of such distinguished companies. A great honor. So thank you very much for your hospitality. I want to talk today about what I consider, in a rather unsystematic way, about the various principles, moral principles, that, in my view, comprise the liberal case for humanitarian intervention. And I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to have a couple of reflections for the future, which is the title of this panel, the future, including the R2P report and future of that, and a few things about Libya. But I would like to start from the beginning. I mean, what is the liberal case for humanitarian intervention? The first thing, there are two kinds of principles in terms of their degree of abstraction, if you will. The main is there are some principles that are basic principles of international ethics, and there are more concrete principles that pertain to the use of force in defense of human rights. The basic principles of international ethics. The first one would be something that goes like this. Governments are mere agents of the people, states and governments. And consequently, whatever international rights and duties that they may have derive in some sense from the rights and interests of individuals that constitute the state. So I reject any notion of the state as an entity that by virtue of its sovereignty or by virtue of life in common or something of that sort enlarges its rights or its duties under international law. I think that any philosophically accurate account of the international rights of the state has to be a translation in some way, an algorithm, if you will, of derivation from the rights of and interests of individuals. That cannot, I don't know how to write that algorithm, but I think it has to be something of that sort. So this may not always have been, in fact, international law perhaps emerged in the early days as just a very modest system of modus vivendi among states, simply just trying to secure a minimal peace and so on and so forth. The problem is that I think phenomena like tyranny, for example, and the way the states started treating their own citizens, I think has forced us, modernly at least, to reconsider this idea. But here I follow people like Babe's early work and others. My view is basically a Kantian inspired view. My view of the state is an entity created by ethical agents to protect the rights and to solve important problems of coordination that arise in social life. It has been always often said. Now, this view of the legitimacy of the state is a very thick view. It's quite controversial. Some people don't agree with it. For example, John Rawls, and for example, David Cobb and others who think that the state's international legitimacy is thin. It's like the old way. It's not just the state is legitimate internationally if it just fulfills certain minimal functions of order, providing order. Now, I will not go into this. I debated these authors elsewhere, and I think it's an inadequate view of legitimacy. But I will say this much here. It doesn't matter for humanitarian intervention, because even if you have the thin view of the state, everybody agrees that the kinds of humanitarian emergencies or catastrophes or whatever that justify humanitarian intervention, everybody agrees on those, that those are abhorrent, and those. So I think that the issue that worries Rawls is that he doesn't want to exclude what he calls decent hierarchical societies from the international community. Wants to treat those, even though they are not liberal, even though we wouldn't want to live there, they want to treat those as members in good standing of the international community. I disagree with that. I think the members in good standing are only liberal democracies. I am sorry if this people disagree with this, but that's my view, has always been my view, and will continue to be my view. So the Kantian liberal alliance, I think what Kant talked about republics, by which he meant basically constitutional democracy, that's the club. That's a big club, and it's hard to get in. You have to really behave well to get into that club. But for the rest, you have norms that deal with those who are not yet on the club, and so on and so forth. All of this is a separate debate, because humanitarian intervention has to do with the use of force. And I agree with Rawls. If Rawls and David Cobb's point is liberal democracies, just because they are better or because they are fully legitimate,